Cultural Arts Coordinator here at Peconic Landing. I just have a quick announcement for our members. There was a miscommunication, I'll say, in the way that we marketed the event here. So today's panel will be Rising Rents, Rising Tides, and it's still focused on the environment, but on how we solve the affordable housing problem while considering how to preserve our precious resources. So I will hand it over to Anne Murray, the Southold Land Use Coordinator, and the panel will begin. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm just here briefly to introduce you to an extraordinary young man, Liam Brew, who is a resident of Orient, graduated from Greenport High School in 2021, and majored in political science and Spanish. He's currently working in Greenport, and he contacted us back in February with a great idea, which was, I'd like to do a program on affordable housing and how it fits in with our environment on the North Fork. And that's so important. I was like, wow, nobody's ever done this before, let's do it. So, this extraordinarily talented young man put this all together. Please welcome Liam and enjoy the program.
I just want to say thanks so much for the super nice intro, Anne Murray, who made everything here possible, including having this great event space at Peconic Landing. And thank you to everyone who made time to be here today. And I just thought it'd be great to talk about both of these crises, preserving our environment as well as the housing crisis, because they both revolve around the central question of how do we best use the limited space and resources that we have on this beautiful place we all call home. So I kind of first want to get a feel of the audience. Do we have any environmentalists out here, members of NFEC, Group for East End? Anyone else who's done some affordable housing stuff or housing in general? How many real estate agents out here? Hey. Cool. Does anyone know someone or has someone in their family who's struggled with affordable housing in North Fork? Yeah, a lot of us. Yeah, so I've kind of like to segue to our town supervisor, Al Krowski, to give a special introduction to this event. If you so kind of come up here.
I'd just like to thank Peconic Landing for hosting. They're always very generous with their space, and we always appreciate whenever there's an event here for the public. And also thank North Fork Environmental Council for having this really important forum. It's always very welcome, and obviously well run. So thank you for having this great panel. I just want to say that our town is really been planned for decades, and what you have today is a result of all that work that took place. And I'm not going to go through all the list of all the different planning exercises. I'll just say that there was we call it the US-UK exchange, where a group actually went over to Southold in England to look at how they prevented sprawl. And they focused the report, it's a very good report, it's available if anyone wants to take a look at it. They focused on farmland preservation, open space preservation to prevent sprawl. They focused on trying to preserve and support and encourage local businesses. And the last thing was they also focused on the importance of affordable housing. That report was 1994. So you can see that this is a very good topic. It's still very important, and we're really looking forward to hearing this today.
That said, I just want to start off this great panel with our first question to the panelists, actually. In 3 words or less, could all of you just say, panelist by panelist, one solution to the housing crisis, big or small, that you think more people should be talking about? I guess I'll start from left to right.
Community Land Trust.
I have 7 of them. Create a new hamlet.
Maybe yours isn't working?
I think I got it. I would say housing authority.
I know it's more than 3 words, but I do echo Dinni's community land trust concept, but we also need some regulation.
All right, so I'm gonna start this off with my first question being to Gwynn Schroeder. So as everyone knows, in the last few decades, North Fork has changed a lot. And a lot of that has been just increased development. So I was wondering, how has North Fork kind of navigated this increased development in the last few decades in terms of environmental preservation? And how has this increased development affected the North Fork's environment in the last few decades?
So one of the town's biggest efforts is land preservation, and that started, Al referenced many studies, there were dozens, probably more, and the community, those studies were done by community members or community stakeholder groups. I served on the Cutchoff Hamlet stakeholder group. So I think, and this is kind of I don't want to get into the land preservation right now, but actually land preservation helps us build affordable housing. And I'll explain that further later on, but it has to do with how we deal with our wastewater. And we are a very fragile environment. We have a very thin layer of lands of water, and we don't have sewers. So those are 2 things. But our environment is pretty fragile. I just want to say that density does not necessarily equate to affordability. It's planning and hard work. And I always say if density equated affordability, New York City would be affordable, and it's not. So it's really about what kind of housing we develop, and it has to do with tax code, a lot of different reasons. Investors that have come out here that have, for-profit investors. So those things, when I said regulation before, that's what I meant. And the town is undertaking a short-term rental code, which I think will increase the housing stock. So, but I'm grateful because in my lifetime, I've lived here just about my whole life, and summer before I didn't, and I'm in my mid-60s. I see the drastic change, and sometimes it's painful to me because we've turned. And I just want to say one thing about food security and Maslow. I don't know if any nurses are in the room, but I was a registered nurse for many years, and we started studying Maslow. Water, oxygen, number 1, water, food. And we preserved a lot of farmland. Food security is going to be an issue moving forward. So we just always have to keep that in the back of our minds.
I guess I'd like to my next question to Dinni. Just thinking about density. That's been such a big debate in the last few years as housing prices has really ramped up across America. And to your point, even though New York City is so dense, it still struggles with affordable housing. But the argument of many pro-density people would be that there's so much demand to live in, the greatest city in the world, New York City, that it would be even more unaffordable without the density. So I guess I'll just want to ask Dinni, as the chair of affordable housing in Greenport Village, what do you think the role of density has been for Greenport in creating affordable housing, and maybe what the rest of the North Fork could learn from Greenport Village? Because Greenport Village has definitely gotten more expensive, but because of the density, it's also been able to support the vast majority of affordable housing in the North Fork.
Well, I wish I could say that housing in Greenport.
Microphone.
Yes. Sit down. This one, yes. Is it? You do. I wish I could say that housing in Greenport is widely affordable. It's not. There are areas where there are houses that people can afford, but that's not the same thing. And many of the houses that people can afford are not in good repair. And as there is more and more demand, often from people who are not going to be full-time residents or give a tremendous amount to the community, the situation gets worse. And I'm concerned especially because not only is there not enough housing, not good quality housing, but people are being removed from their housing by landlords who want to renovate or sell and bring in a better class of tenant. So rental housing, which is what is most affordable as opposed to home ownership, is very limited, and people are losing what they have. So I'm very, very concerned about that.
And I guess I'm just kind of gonna play devil's advocate here, because many people in these pro-density circles do say, oh, when people are getting priced out, you know, these landlords are following incentives where if there were competition, where people were building more types of housing, more increasing the housing stock, then they would have to lower prices to compete. So I guess I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, or is it just more complicated than that, where there needs to be dedicated investment in affordable housing?
I think it is more complicated than that. But I do think what happens, at least we're now talking about Greenport and about the North Fork, is that the demand is so great that providing more housing is not alone going to bring the price down. It will just bring more people here, I think. Of course, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that when I look at people coming to Greenport and wanting to be here part-time or full-time, and there are an awful lot of people who are looking for part-time housing here. There is enough demand so that increasing the supply is not necessarily going to lower price.
Related to that, a huge crisis lately has been short-term rental. There was a recent Suffolk Times article talking about the fact that there are 1,000 short-term rentals. So that's 1,000 homes that many of which were occupied by working families, local year-round residents that have kind of been converted into just temporary Airbnbs for tourists to stay in. So I guess I was just going to ask Andrea, since you've been working as the community development project supervisor, about how Southold Town has been kind of working to curb this kind of short-term rental crisis.
Yeah, I would say actually the most familiar person with this is Gwynn in regards to the short-term rentals. So,
what I will say the town did their due diligence. We worked with the New York State Association of Towns to find out what had been tried, what had gone through the courts and been knocked down, what made it through the courts. So I think the ultimate goal is to not eliminate them completely, but to decrease their number drastically. And the town board is still negotiating the finer details of that in the code committee, so I really can't say more than that. But there are a lot of people. I was on a committee, our principal planner, I think Mara, and this is our assistant principal planner, Mara. She was on the committee. There are a lot of good people, like our town attorney. So I think it's a good product, and it just has to go through public hearing. So when it does, I hope everybody shows up and supports it. So.
I was just thinking about the other kind of hindrance to building more affordable housing. And it's actually a quote from Alexa Seuss, this town councilwoman from Southold Town, who unfortunately cannot be here tonight, but she told me, going into the affordable housing crisis, she thought the biggest challenge was NIMBYism. And the more she learned, she realized the real challenge is all things sewage. Because without sewers, we just can't support density and just an abundance of apartments, even if those are affordable apartments. I I guess I just want to turn this question to Glynis, because you were kind of an expert in this sustainable septic system.
I'm trying to get away from that. That wasn't the question you gave me to answer. That's sneaky. Yes, the sewage is a huge issue for a couple of reasons. One, we have a very fragile aquifer and surface water situation. So all our wastewater that is going through relatively porous soils and contaminating our drinking water, so we do have to protect it. But one of the things that stops the kind of zoning we would like and the kind of densities we would like is the Suffolk County Department of Health regulations, because it's based on flow per acre. And if you're on a well, it's even less, and about slightly less than half are still on wells. And there's a weird kind of issue with that, in that if you have a residence, you can have as many bedrooms as you want, as long as you can fit the system. But when you have more than 2 units, it goes into a commercial regulation, and under that commercial regulation, it's much more controlled and reduced. So if I had a small lot, I could have as many bedrooms as I wanted on the health department. But if I wanted to put more than 2 units, I wouldn't be able to. So I might have two 600 square foot apartments. It would be limited for 1 acre on a well. But I could have a house with 10 bedrooms if I wanted. So there are weird code issues.
So do you think there's a big issue here is kind of this double standard where we don't really give much scrutiny to these kind of bigger houses, these McMansions, which have, in truth, really proliferated across Norfolk as these higher wealth buyers have come onto the scene? And actually, there was a Suffolk Times report recently about how there's a new market for compounds.
I totally agree, because some of these big houses that are being built are almost more like private clubs. You know, where they have swimming pools and they irrigate the lawns, and they use much more water than if we had year-round homes. So I think that's something that the code should consider, on what that use is and where the line is. And then maybe if you have more than X bedrooms, you consider it commercial property rather than residential. You know, but at the same time, so if you had community sewers, you would probably be able to exceed that amount, and you could look at your density differently. So I'm not sure, did I answer the question?
Can I add just one little comment, that I think we need to be talking about the environmental consequences of unaffordable homes. I mean, this is, we don't talk about, we just talk about the sort of the current crisis that we see for affordable housing, but really in terms of environmental degradation, the large homes for very rich people are those that use the most resources. It's a little bit like the international situation where the poor countries contribute less to our climate crisis than the rich countries, and yet they are the ones who suffer most. And I feel that's sort of an analogy to what we have here with the consequences of unaffordable housing.
Could I add a couple of things?
I just want to say, everyone here is free to chime in whenever they want, also, so, yeah, I'd like.
Okay, I totally agree, and a few years ago, we did a study on water use in the town of Southold, and 46% of Suffolk, we used Suffolk County Water Authority's data and then applied that to the people on wells. And 46% of the water consumption was in the summer and 31% in the autumn. So that implies the seasonal use. The median vary greatly from the average, and this is what you're talking about. Because the average was 559 gallons per household, and that was 2.4 times what the national average was. But if you looked at the median was only 247, and that was very close to the national average. So 39% consumed at a rate over 150%. And then we also looked at the value of the house, because we didn't have, the square footage. And it's not a totally linear thing, because there are some very, people with big houses that are environmentally conscious, but basically, the bigger the house, the more resources they use.
Yeah, it is quite thin. So it seems to be kind of the picture we're seeing across the country where, there's a small, wealthy minority of people who are just hoarding so many resources. And I guess this brings me to this question of, should we really be setting limits on these lot sizes, on how much water these estates can consume in the summer? Is that legally feasible? I'm asking this to pass out of water officials too. Is this possible to actually say, hey, the buck stops here, in order not just for affordable housing, but for us to have water in the future? Can we actually limit these lot sizes for these big estates?
And to that, if you put a swimming pool in, that can double the water use of a house. And if you irrigate, it's multiple times that, irrigating lawns. So you might have to zone swimming pools, not just put one everywhere. So you have to balance, because if you really want housing, there's a carrying capacity of the land. And maybe you have to figure out what the priorities are and how you assign those resources.
Thinking of that carrying capacity, it just seems like over the decades, we're finally kind of reckoning with these things that have been building up over time. Do you think that North Fork really needs a reckoning where entire kind of neighborhoods might have to sit down and say, we really might have to pare down on this consumption and, all these sprinkler systems we have in our yards. And I think car tendency is another factor in this as well. Should I repeat that?
Yes, louder.
Yes. I guess adding to this, do we do entire kind of neighborhoods and communities that are, the kind of culprits of this overconsumption? Do they really need to have, reckoning about this and have physical constraints put in place where we say, and this is something I think the government, this all the time has been trying to do lately, no sprinkler on this particular part of the day, limiting banning mansions, honestly. Should we ban these large lot sizes? Should we ban certain zoning, all over 400, for example?
I think we're not going to speak to that, but I just want to speak to, Glynis touched on sanitary flow and because we've been hearing a lot lately that we should put the same amount of effort into housing as we did in land preservation. And I would encourage everybody to look at this map up here. And when the town preserves open space, what we do is we get those sanitary flow credits. And those sanitary flow credits, this isn't a situation where there's no sewers if you have septic tanks, the septic systems. And because we preserve that open space, and that open space will be preserved in perpetuity, can never be used for anything else because the sanitary flow has been taken off of it. That's how we get density in areas where we studied where we think housing should go, in the hamlet areas, in the downtown areas that are walkable. And that makes more sense. And we always joke, a couple of years ago, the governor came out with transit-oriented development. And I'm like, well, first, the North Fork needs some transit, and then that would work. But it's because I think we have 3 trains a day or something. And so I can't stress enough how important it is that open space is, that we preserved over the years, that took decades to do, and hard work of many people to get that done. And we have county partners and in some instances state partners. But our town preserved land, that enables us to create affordable housing where we don't have sewers. And it's through, we have a bank of sanitary flow credits, and I just want to remind everybody, not only do we have a budget for sanitary flow credits, we have a budget for money too. So we have to be careful what we're doing, because it's not gazillions of dollars. If you look at the income, like that East Hampton's brought in and Southampton, the same period of time, it's like 6 or 7 times what we bring in. So that's part of our program. We want people to partner with the state and get other funding too. So, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure, I mean, I can talk about like the challenges of actually developing housing in this area. So as Gwynn mentioned, the sanitary flow credits is limited, so we need to be very intentional on where we're gonna place them in the town of Southold. On top of that, the cost of constructions, particularly for affordable units, is not inexpensive. It's actually very expensive, as we found. And so we, 9 times out of 10, particularly for homeownership units, developers are stacking subsidy sources. So the community housing fund alone may not be sufficient enough for a developer to build affordable housing here, which is why we encourage state funding sources. The other kind of taboo aspect of this is that developers need to be very well versed in fair housing laws and ensure that they understand who they can cater affordable opportunities to. And then finally, it's the fact that we need to understand the AMI levels, which I think is kind of like a newer concept of who can actually be affordable in the town of Southold. So right now, the current code says that it's one person making $138,000 a year. So that's a pretty large number that Gwynn and I have been working to reevaluate, recommend different options. I think the last time we recommended was 80% of AMI, which is still $87,000. So that just puts into context the kind of how unaffordable truly the North Fork has become over the years, and how hard it is to build units for affordable housing. And just to clarify, AMI is the area median income.
To the point, I mean, especially just with tariffs and supply chain problems, yes, construction has become more of a problem. And I guess I was also wondering, related to, has someone considered kind of just building housing on top of parking lots? Especially, we're talking about as well as near LIR stations as a way to build more housing, because lately in cities across the country like Atlanta, for example, and in Minneapolis as well, and in Austin, there's been this whole movement to just take this low-hanging fruit. Most of the time, parking spaces are vacant. You'll see this at the Matatuck Shopping Center in King Cullen. You'll see it in that huge parking lot in Southold where the LIR station is. I think the Southold LIR is actually the least used station in the whole system. So to me, it would make sense to just say, hey, let's build a bunch of buildings on the parking lots, or is it more complicated than that?
I would say it's definitely more complicated. And I think the concept is interesting, but the actual details of it is maybe more of a long-term, it could become a long-term goal. I think our programs are more focused on things we can do faster, whatever that means, and that's the construction of accessory dwelling units, giving subsidies to developers who own properties that they are looking to develop units on, and then the creation of first-time homebuyer loans.
Yeah. So whatever that means. So I guess I'm gonna piggyback on that. So since just building apartments and parking lots is actually way easier said than done, what is the best way for building more affordable housing? Is it so? I'm sure that a lot of you have attended these hearings about ADUs, for example, which has been a whole program where you can build a smaller house in the back of your yard. And actually, my family lives in an ADU, and it's been really helpful for us affording housing out here. Is ADUs the best path forward, or does that have its own challenges? Or
yeah, I would say all of these different housing typologies are generally new as a response to the housing crisis. For example, the Long Island Housing Partnership ADU+1 program was kind of like testing to see whether people would want it. Now I think New York City has a loan program for $300,000 just to show like the cost of construction. And so I think the community housing plan recommends this as a potential option to provide more units. But again, there's not like there's no solution because it's systematic, and yeah, the affordable housing crisis will not be solved through ADUs only.
So is it like a slightly, like, is there kind of a Goldilocks type of housing here? Because, a little more dense than ADUs, but not quite, 5-story apartment. I guess I was actually, Glynis, gave any ideas about it? Because we were talking about just how the North Fork is not a new place. We're not like Phoenix. We've been around for the entire history of America, much older than most of America, and we've had, in that time, all types of housing. So are there any kind of older types of housing that we've kind of forgotten about that might be useful for the North Fork?
Well, by chance, there was a Greenport woman who just wrote a story about her family, and they basically had it was a hotel, but it was functioning as a single room occupancy building. And we need things like that. Greenport actually has the most affordable seasonal housing in their campground. So maybe we need some campgrounds that are used by people with seasonal jobs, not just tourists. Hamlet zoning. The hamlets that we love were based on zoning with small lots. And the zoning that overlays them is suburban zoning. It's not designed for the hamlets. And that makes it harder for those people because every time they want to do something, it requires a variance. It's more expensive, it takes longer. In fact, Mastic Beach just changed their zoning because everybody needed a variance. So, so maybe we need hamlet zoning that allows people to work as of right within smaller lot sizes. And then maybe they even need to consider a new hamlet. With mixed uses, don't make ghettos of one type of housing, have a mixture of things. And well, at least a number of our hamlets are very threatened by sea rise. So we might need
Sorry.
sorry.
So sorry to interrupt. I just want to kind of get some clarification. So you mentioned this in the beginning, making a new hamlet. At first I was like, we're just going to create a whole new town, but by this do you mean like a new type of zoning? Or?
I mean both. We need hamlet zoning that overlays the historic districts, and we may want to consider that we need a new location that has hamlet zoning, like maybe taking Peconic and massaging that into more of a hamlet, or taking a whole other location that makes sense to allow tiny lots. And that goes into the economics. And shut me off if I talk too much, but I think too many investors own the homes. And like in Greenport, most of those homeowners rented under Section 8, and then when the tourists started being more lucrative, they switched to the seasonal rentals. So we lost those rentals. But if you own your home, and it's your most valuable asset, because the market's strong, then people sell and they move to a place where it's more affordable to live. So it's their asset that they have to leave it behind in order to have a sustainable life.
So you're saying even homeowners, even though they kind of benefit from getting the money from like the home rising in value, even they are affected by the rising prices?
Absolutely, they relocate. I did a study for the village of Southampton on a traditional black neighborhood, and the houses were being, half the houses were owned by investors and half of them were selling out to the investors and then moving south.
Well, it seems like,
Yeah.
Greenport does not yet have lots of investors owning houses. A few, but not a whole lot. We do have what the mayor calls zombie houses, houses that are vacant most of the time, which is a terrible irony in a place where there's a. Am I not? It's not
That's
bad.
bad. Oh, that's bad.
Thank you,
That's
yeah. In a place where there is such a terrible need for housing. I wanted to say something about also sort of an asterisk to what Glynis was saying about how people manage, how people negotiate their situations when they are pressed, which is that the McCann campground, she's correct, is low income, affordable housing for people during the season. But many of the people who are in the campground during the season are homeowners who can afford to keep their homes only because they rent them out and then move into the campgrounds for the summer. So, you know, there are many negotiations which people make in order to deal with the problem of affordable housing, unaffordable housing. I also wanted to say something about NIMBY. It was mentioned very briefly, but Liam had us, each of us, special questions, some of which he doesn't seem to be using. But I'm going to answer one of them anyway. They were such good questions, so we have to spend a little time on them. And one of them was, why suburban development does not get the same level, it does not generate the same level of concern about the environment that the specter of development out here gets. We are all concerned about environment, and I think some of the concern is simply that it's different from the suburban sprawl, is that we are, the suburbs used to be considered the place you would go, the respite, the paradise, the place which had clean air and, clean air and lots of grass. And so I think there's a kind of using the environmental issue as a reason to oppose affordable housing becomes a very convenient and sort of logical way to address a kind of, to invoke a kind of NIMBYism. And it's the kind of NIMBYism that it's universal, it's understandable, and it's virtuous. So I think one of the things we need to do is to get people to examine the sort of levels of NIMBYism that they apply to affordable housing.
I just want to respond a little bit to that. Because we do have hearings and people in neighborhoods, when we propose something, do object in various ways. And I think what's important is if you're a proponent of affordable housing, you know that the town is having a hearing, you should come and express your feelings. Because the people that don't want it will be, whatever side of the fence you stand on, whether you want affordable housing or you don't, I would just encourage people to come out and testify before whatever board is, whether it's a town board, the zoning board, the planning board, because that's where we need people to show up. It's great to come to like these kinds of things, but because in my other life I was an advocate, right? So showing up matters, and that's really important. So I would encourage everybody to do that, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, affordable housing.
I guess my follow-up question to that would be, are all these community hearings kind of necessary as well? Because one thing, this is kind of a pattern across America where there are all these hearings for every single housing, proposal. And a lot of people are saying, why do we need the hearings when, first of all, many of the people who would benefit are busy working and are not able to attend. And you know, there are many cases where the apartments are not really, you know, going to negatively affect the environment. So people say the process itself could kind of be an unnecessary impediment. Do you think there are some cases, like in the case of what Glynis was saying about just fixing, like, could we just fix the zoning so those affordable housing developments are just allowed in the first place with the right conditions? Or
That's kind of democracy. I mean, it is. I mean, I don't mean to be blunt, but, you know, anybody that wants to participate, whether it's the zoning update or, you know, whatever the town is considering at any period of time, I mean, I think it's better when more people participate in that process. And like when planning does an initiative, they do plenty of outreach, because then you have, you know, when you've done your due diligence and you've done a plan and you believe in it, then when somebody challenges you, you have a better leg to stand on. So I think it's important, you know, and, you know, everybody thinks the town is not a monolith. There's a lot of people in the town, elected officials, that, you know, they're not a monolith. They all have different ideas and different suggestions. And I think that through that public process, that all comes to the fore, and that's important. And, yeah.
Related to that.
Could I just add to that? I think the hearings are very, very important, and we now have the technology to enable people to attend the hearings. They can attend the hearings on Zoom, or they can stream them later. I mean, we need to develop be sure that we're using the technology we have. But I think that's a way to bring people into greater civic engagement of the kind of thing you're talking about.
Thank you, COVID.
And also, I mean, an example is the recent hearing that you were at, and that the supervisor was very articulate in talking about, which was about subdivisions. How do we manage subdivisions to retain as much farmland as possible, to have the conservation subdivisions and the regular subdivisions to include some affordable housing. So, you know, to hear these messages, you have to go to the meetings or attend them with some modern technology that is useful.
Just a couple of things. I think you have the hearings to decide the general rules, but then make it simple for people. Let them build as of right without each person having to go through the same process. If they follow those rules that you have carefully done, like for the ADUs, not every ADU has to have a hearing. Second thing, to think about how we use the money. Some of the buildings are almost affordable for people, but it's a seller's market, and it's the people with cash that get those structures. So if you had a program where you went in and you bought with cash, then you turned around and sold it, took your time selling it to people that needed a mortgage, you would at least be getting people who were residents getting the properties and getting equity, because you know, they're just pushed out sometimes. And one thing the North Fork Alliance did was they bought some buildings and then subdivided them into smaller apartments. So it looks the same. I don't think we should necessarily just build our way out of it. We need to be smarter in how we manage what we have as well.
I think that's all we have for the official discussion. So I actually want to move on to the Q&A section, where we will call on people in the audience to ask some questions that might have been burned to ask for a while now.
I don't hear any of you talking about building up. At the corner of Main and Front, the old Mills building is 3 stories. There are there are some buildings that are, there are many that aren't. What does anybody have to say about building up as opposed to smaller?
May I take that since I'm on the zoning board? We are talking on the zoning board and in the village board about building up, about allowing, changing our code to permit a third story. And we also have now, we are waiting for a decision, which I think will be affirmative, for the state providing technical assistance, a sort of pre-development analysis, which doesn't obligate the landowner to do anything, but provides the information that the landowner would need to move forward if he or she wanted to build up. And I think the combination of the activity of that work and work on discussing code changes that will allow a third story is going to help with that downtown development, which could provide apartments upstairs from the retail below. I worry that those apartments won't be affordable. I have a friend who said, when I said we were talking about this stuff, she said, it would be a wonderful weekend. I'd love to come up and live above the store on the weekends. No. That is not what we need. And I don't know how we contain that.
I guess the question is like whether we can find a balance, because there's been this concept known as filtering, where building housing for both, people who need affordable housing and then people who just might want to have another story is important, because what we've seen happen in Greenport is even when you don't build housing for wealthy people, they will then take away housing that was originally affordable. And we've seen this on First Street, where all these houses were triplexes or duplexes inhabited by multiple working families. Because we didn't build the luxury housing that those wealthier people would have otherwise taken, they then just took housing anyway. So the question is, how do we kind of balance both of these things, or do we just prioritize making, protected affordable housing? So it's complicated.
I'm very recently living in the North Fork, and while Southampton and East Hampton are certainly no examples, they did have a housing, or they do have a housing authority, and were able to build, after much angst in the community, did build affordable housing based on the AMI indexes, and even we lived for a while in a condo development of 40 units, and many of those were affordable housing. So I'm wondering if that is something that is done here.
So initially, you heard me say housing authority is one of the things we need, because I feel like the reason why a lot of things stop being affordable, especially if they're designed that way, is because there's no one keeping up with ongoing compliance, no one's managing the properties, or at least overseeing the manager. So East Hampton and Southampton have that benefit of a housing authority, which really coordinates with developers. They coordinate to make sure that the tenants living there can still live there per the AMI rates that they set. And one of the goals in the comprehensive plan is to hopefully establish a housing authority, or find a way to how we can do that, because it's definitely a need. So in Southold, because we don't have that, we have to program it in such a way that we would require developers to have that ongoing compliance in some way, shape, or form, as they would with the housing authority, but maybe arm's length from what the town housing department does.
I just want to make clear that a housing authority is not an entity of the town. It's a separate nonprofit that has a corporate structure, and just so everybody understands that, because I didn't really understand that, embarrassingly, until a couple of years ago. So.
Okay, just from kind of left field. A few years ago, we were traveling through Western Canada, and we ended up in a place called Banff. Banff is a resort town. It has a lot of hotels. It has it's a beautiful place, and many people wanted to be there as part-time residents. They were able to pass town regulations which said that the only people who could buy property within a certain area of the town had to either be working there, or were committed to starting a business and keeping that business going for 5 years. So it immediately constrained the marketplace and kept the price subdued. The second element of it was they had these massive big hotels, some quite old, some newer, and the hotels were expected to set aside a certain percentage of their property for housing for their workforce, because they were attracting a seasonal workforce. And I know here, some of the local innkeepers and restaurant owners have done that. But I thought these were just as a way of kind of thinking outside of the box. And there are many reasons probably why we can't do something like that. But I just wanted to sort of open up the thinking beyond where we are right now, because it's going to take way out thinking to solve the problems.
So it's interesting that you talked about the community in Canada. So just a couple of days ago, there was a lawsuit against Oyster Bay, and after 10 years, they've come to a settlement with the state and federal governments. It was a fair housing issue, and what they settled on is they had a requirement that only eligible people from the town could apply. It would only be open to those people. Their settlement was they would take that provision out of their law, and they also, the court mandated that the town officials take fair housing courses for a period of time. So it's a little more complicated than that. And, there are many, business owners who do either rent housing for their employees or buy housing for their employees. But when you have a house connected to a job, your health insurance, and your home, that could create a whole nother social problem if you lose your job. Because I actually worked with somebody when I worked with Al in the legislature that had that problem. He lost his job, he lost his home. He wasn't quite 65. He was a person that worked with his body every day, and he couldn't work anymore. And so we just have to be careful how we manage that. I think that's my opinion. So there are issues about that, but we certainly need workforce housing. But we also have to look at the income of the workforce in relation to how much we're charging for rents, or we allowed to be charged for rents. And that's the other issue.
Hi, I'm Joan Tripp, and I was working with Cochrane for many years and Alan Schneider for many years. So I just wanted to tackle this a little bit from the standpoint of the developers and the brokers. When people hear the word low-cost housing, they kind of shut it down. They don't want it next to their property, or they feel that it's going to influence and create a population that perhaps is not quite as desirable. So I think a lot of the public hearings that they have to try to develop low-cost housing, if they could in some way make that property that they're going to consider low cost, either building, apartments, whatever it is you're doing, really do an advertising job, making it very, very attractive. Not necessarily just focusing on, oh, it's wonderful because we're providing low-cost housing. But I think you have to get it across to your neighborhood, to your other investors, to your people with high-cost property, and make the low-cost property that you're developing as attractive in advertising and also, of course, in the actual building as you can. And that's very, very important when you're holding public meetings to get approvals, zoning changes, and whatever else you may need to do it. I wish you very good luck with it, but really think about how you advertise it.
I'd like to respond to that. Thank you for saying that. Because affordable housing is not poor housing. It needs to be well designed. It needs to be designed environmentally so the carrying costs are low, and it needs to be a wonderful place that people want to be and take care of. And, there are studies that, and the streetscape with lots of trees, there's less crime as well. So thank you for saying that, because I think that's so important.
I agree. Oh, am I allowed to ask?
I'd say we're almost out of time, but we'll take One more
Let me
question.
say real fast, the housing authorities are appointed by the town board in East Hampton, so there is the control of picking people to be on them for staggered terms. And I am really disappointed to see that there's a lot of talk about affordable single-family houses when housing construction has gotten so expensive. And if things were dense and it was some acreage we're talking about, couldn't there be open space surrounding the density that could be used as drainage fields for the sewage, whatever it is, the upgraded, you know, that fancy kind of.
A septic system?
Yeah, I would much rather see density rather than when we build. It just seems so wasteful to build sprawl right now. Also, the zoning maps, I'm so sorry that we're updated coming into Greenport. You know, we've got Moore's Woods and a lot of greenery. We also have these weird business zones, and they need to be changed to some kind of low-density residential so that we don't have the business sprawl. If you look on 48 at, in Magtech by Marituka, and those big warehouses, commercial warehouses that are built on spec, that are the ugliest things on our scenic byway that's supposed to look natural and would preserve all this land, and then there are these buildings. Those were spot zoned in our zoning code now on maps, and sprinkled around in the wrong places in Manatuck. And it would be really great if the zoning code maps could be cleaned up. Anyway, thank you.
Hi, my name is Susan Kenzie. I'm on the board of the Norfolk Environmental Council, and I am one of the first individuals of affordable housing in Southold town. 1987, they did a project where they had 14 affordable houses. At the time, they did it all wrong. I was allowed to qualify. I was a single individual making $16,000 a year. I was competing with people that were families of 7 that had to make less than 42 to qualify. The only reason I'm standing here today is because I bought that house. There's not many young people that can afford to buy houses now. And the only reason I'm here is because of that. With that said, I do have a question regarding the ADU units. The town had a program about a year ago where they were given grants.
So essentially, a program that we entered into an agreement with Long Island Housing Partnership. It wasn't necessarily our program, but it had 2 components. It had their requirements, which was the homeowner had to qualify financially. So it was really tailored to keep homeowners in their house and give them an extra stream of income. And then there's the zoning laws that we have. And so, so they didn't always, mesh up. And so, we talked about the housing plan, that town, the CHO was passed, we had the housing plan, but the housing plan wasn't really starting to be implemented. So you have a plan, then you have to implement the plan. So we're trying to go through that ADU code to kind of do some of those things that were preventing people from applying. And one of the things, quite frankly, people couldn't find contractors, and the cost of things are really high. And, it was just hard. So we're trying to, in our program, we're trying to, fix some of those things that prevented people from applying and getting the grant. It's not gonna be a grant in our case, we'll probably be a loan. But it just kind of, those factors kind of just prevented. We ended up, I think, with 8 grants in our town, but
Hi, yes, I think it's all about density. I think it's about multifamily housing. That's what we need. I think Greenport and Riverhead have set up the sewer systems, and they can have the density that we need. Southold, for many years, for decades, some people even say, since the 1940s, has resisted putting in a sewer system, which means that every affordable housing or workforce housing unit thing that's proposed is limited. And like right behind the Bank of America opposite Feather Hill, there's a space there that could have 20 units, and only 6 are going in. Now maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe it's a little less than 20, but I mean that's what we need. We need multifamily housing. It's a great thing. Multifamily has got a bad name from the NIMBY crowd and from the whole single family thing. None of this is new. ADUs aren't new. Multifamily housing is not new. We did all this in the past. It's been done in the past. Accessory buildings and ADUs after the Second World War. We need to get back to common sense stuff and get away from the whole NIMBYism and resistance.
I mean, the supervisor, do you want to speak this?
No, go ahead.
Well, when Al was a legislator, he sat on sewer agency for the county. To build sewers are tens of millions of dollars. And we would, I'm telling you, we would not be the same community with sewers. And just to hook up a sewer to one home is between $10,000 and $15,000. It's not the more infrastructure you have and the more housing that you have, your taxes go up. Just to look at Southold's taxes compared to Huntington's taxes. They have very dense, but their property taxes are really high. And that's creating a whole another problem. Sewer, and the federal government, as far as I know, is not really subsidizing. The last big sewer project I did on Long Island was the Southwest Sewer District. Google it. It was sort of a nightmare. So what the county did is they created these innovative alternative septic systems, which not only cleans up the groundwater, and big sewer systems, they don't discharge underground. A lot of them discharge. Greenport sewer system discharges into the Long Island Sound. So not only do we have this thin clay layer of water, we're just sucking water out of the ground and we're discharging it into the sound. The sound in this case. And all the big sewer, like Bergen Point, it all goes into surface waters. None of that is recharged. And that's one of our biggest problems. We're gonna be dealing with saltwater intrusion in the future. I mean, we have a lot of, we're a dense island. Our population is probably more than 1.5 just million in Suffolk County. And we have a higher population than 11 states. We are a dense place. And that's why I say, I think we need regulation rather than, I agree with the panelists that we have to be more creative with how we solve it, rather than just building.
So,
And that's what I'd like to jump in. I was told to jump in here. Being more creative and looking at, I'm from the town of Southold and many generations, and lived in Western Suffolk in Nassau since I graduated from high school, which was many of our situations. Work isn't, not jobs, and not a place where we could afford to live either. I'm back. But with my experience from up the island, and one of the things I'd like to suggest that we look at are housing cooperatives. Because what we need is workforce housing, and we need ownership. With ownership, then the equity is built. That's the only way that families get ahead, generation to generation, is owning a house. So we need, if we look at how can we set up a nonprofit corporation for housing. I lived in the Northport area for quite a while, and it took decades to build some housing for the workforce housing, because they were looking at, they say affordable housing, and it's all what you're just saying. They're thinking HUD housing, they're thinking subsidized housing, they're thinking very low income, and they're also not equity building. When you're looking, they built, finally, because they switched to a housing cooperative, where it's ownership of people, and it's for those who are making between $47,000 and $95,000 a year. That's a lot less than what was just quoted, and my family still couldn't afford to live here with that one. But so I ask us to look at housing cooperatives.
I just want to sing the praises of whoever in 2007, and I don't know if Al was on the town board then, the cottages in Mattatuck. We just sold, 2 sold last year, because they have equity in the house, but they don't get a windfall, which I think is what was referred to before. For a long time, you got a house and then you could sell it for market rate. What the town has done is they say you can't sell for market rate. You can get the cost of living increase, but we sold last year, and people stayed there for a long term. Like, I think at the time, people were they would grow their families, they're advancing their career and then move out, but they haven't. But we sold 2 last year for under $300,000. Or we didn't sell them, the homeowner sold it, but that's what they sold for. So, I mean, we're gonna try to repeat that model. They'll be a little higher, of course, because building materials and everything is more expensive now. But that's like an affordable home ownership model. And it was really, really successful, so we're hoping to repeat that.
I have the mic back here. So I've also thought about cooperative housing, and we have this big building in Greenport, the arcade, and I would love to see our village residents raise money to buy that place and make it do some housing with it, because it already has a sewer, and somebody's book is back here.
Oh,
So,
that's mine, thank you.
there you go.
Okay, I have one quick question myself for anybody on the panel who wants to take it. I've always been curious about these sewer credits that we get from, preserved open space. Exactly how many does the town have? Does anybody know, or give us a ballpark figure?
I don't know, I think it's, I think we just preserved a big parcel in Greenport, so I'm not sure how many we're gonna get off that parcel. So it's over 100, but I'm not exactly sure.
So how many units could be built with that over 100? Say you had 100, how many units could be built?
Oh, that's, it usually is based on gallons per day, and I think it's 300 gallons per day. And that's, I think that's right, like 300 gallons a day per credit. So, it depends on your density and how much flow you have.
Okay.
So that's really what it's based on,
Okay, we have about 4 minutes left, Liam. Do you want to make some closing remarks?
I guess I was just gonna ask if, I think 4 minutes is enough time for one more question, if anyone has it?
Thanks. Hey, I'm Katie Stokes from Southold, and I just want to say how grateful I am for panels like this. Because our community housing plan, our comprehensive plan, identified years ago that affordable housing is a crisis on the North Fork. And we've done such a great job at a lot of environmental protection, and we have had almost no new affordable housing. And so I think we all recognize that, how important it is to protect our environment, but that we really have to look at other priorities too. And I love the suggestion earlier about, frankly, marketing, and that we really have to get the message out that affordable housing is really, frankly, about protecting our local character, right? Because if we want housing for our firefighters and everybody else, I think that's super important. But I guess I had one question. I know there's been talk about how maybe we want to lower the AMI that's focused on. But I know that Southold Peconic Civic Association had a meeting about affordable housing 2 years ago maybe. And we had 3 business people and actually one firefighter come in and speak on the panel about the fact they couldn't find any housing to buy, they couldn't afford it. But all 3 of them said that they would not qualify, that they made too much money, because frankly they work multiple jobs, but they made too much money for the lowest AMIs. So, and I know in the affordable housing plan, everywhere else we talk about diverse housing options. So I guess I'm just wondering, is the town also open to focusing on diverse housing options and not just sort of the lowest AMI band?
Yeah, I would say, like I mentioned before, one person at what our current AMI is 120% of AMI, area median income. is someone making $140,000. So that means they're making 20% more than the average income. So that's kind of our parameter currently. As Southampton and East Hampton have done, they kind of target to lower AMIs. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel either. And so 80% AMI is one person making $87,000 a year. And based on our housing registry data, that's like almost 80% of the people on the housing registry, that's their income bracket. Actually, it's lower than that. That's like their maximum income bracket. And so those are the kind of things we took into account when we were reevaluating the area median income requirements for affordability. If that makes sense.
And I just mentioned quickly that the area is Nassau Suffolk. So our median income in Southold is probably probably 20 grand lower than that, because, you know, that's a big area and it's very diverse, so.
All right, I guess that was our final question, and I'm kind of struggling to sum up all of the amazing things we just talked about. I feel like we could have several more panels, because we only kind of scratched the surface, because, you know, there's so many different kind of ways that we explore how to build affordable housing. We're just talking about cooperative housing and kind of creating ownership, and how honestly I think Southold Town really cracked the code for how to really solve the problem of how homeownership has kind of become this double-edged sword, where it's, you know, allowed people to create a nest egg and have a chance at the American dream, but then people block other people from having affordable housing because they don't want their home values to be lowered. And then Southold created these limited equity homeownership, you know, houses in Mattatuck that has been this great solution where people still have the equity, but the home value doesn't rise above a certain point. So I just think that's kind of an underrated thing that I'm so glad we kind of discussed and we talked about, Gwynn, and just other ideas such as people in the audience, or what you talked about, Dinni, about just changing the narratives about affordable housing, fighting the stigmas that have really arisen. Because in a previous event, I think that Dinni, Andrea, and Supervisor Al spoke at a few weeks ago. People were confused. They were like, why do we call it affordable housing? Why do we call it workforce housing? Why do we call it community housing? Because it's a testament to, you know, kind of these deep stigmas, you know. And yeah, I guess it's a matter of just, you know, being able to fundamentally share resources, share the land between each other, and that's, you know, what the environment comes back to as well. So I guess I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for being here. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience who showed up, especially everyone I kind of frantically emailed at the last minute, please, I love you to come here. Appreciate it. See you all. Okay. And also, I would like to give such a special thanks to Anne Marie, who has just been so awesome. I just cold emailed her back in the end of January. I was really inspired by this affordable housing event that she helped put together in August 2024 with Jan Valadeo, if you guys ever know him. He's another big force in the community. And she was right with it as soon as I proposed it. So she was super helpful in getting this Peconic landing venue and finding these great panelists and just, you know, really getting together the ideas for making this happen. So thanks so much, and huge shout out.